My name is Linda. I am a mother, a widow, and a woman who once believed that love was a blank check with no boundaries. I spent 40 years of my life building a reservoir of kindness, thinking that if I poured enough of my soul into the foundations of my children's lives, I would always have a place by their fire. I was wrong. I learned through tears and cold silences that the most expensive walls are not made of brick and mortar, they are the ones built by those we love to keep us out. Before I share with you how I turned my heartbreak into a fortress of dignity, I want to pause and say a heartfelt thank you. Your presence here, in this quiet corner of the digital world, is a gift I do not take lightly. It is a profound privilege to share the scars and the victories of my journey with you. If this story speaks to a part of your soul that has ever felt invisible, or if it reminds you that your worth is non-negotiable, I humbly invite you to join our community. If my words touch your heart today, please subscribe to Queen's Revenge. To those of you who have already walked beside me by subscribing, I offer you my deepest gratitude. It is my sincere prayer that your kindness returns to you 1,000-fold. May your lives be overflowing with abundant wealth, may your homes be saturated with unshakable happiness, and may you always walk a path paved with the respect and prosperity you so richly deserve. Now let us go back to that morning in the attorney's office, where the ink of my heart first met the cold reality of a pen. The fountain pen felt like a lead weight, an anchor of gold and obsidian that seemed to resist the very movement of my hand. Yet my fingers did not tremble. There is a certain stillness that comes to a woman who has already survived the greatest storms of her life, a quietude born from the ashes of grief and the steel of endurance. I sat in that high-backed leather chair, the air in the attorney's office thick with the scent of old parchment, lemon polish, and the stagnant breath of bureaucracy. Sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust that settled onto the polished mahogany table like tiny, forgotten memories. Across from me sat Jared, my only son, my heartbeat walking outside my chest. Beside him Erica, a woman of sharp angles and even sharper ambitions, was perched on the edge of her seat, her manicured fingers curled tightly around the strap of her designer handbag. I looked down at the check. $200,000. To some, it was a mere sequence of zeros, a transactional blip in a digital world. But to me, it was the physical manifestation of 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, and the quiet, unyielding love of a man who was no longer here to see his son fly. This was David's legacy. Every late night he spent at the firm, every weekend missed, every penny saved while we lived in that drafty apartment during our first years of marriage, it was all distilled into this single slip of paper. As I moved the pen toward the signature line, I wasn't just transferring currency. I was pouring the marrow of our history into a new foundation. I was building a fortress for my son. Mom! Jared's voice broke through the silence, soft and tentative, thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. I looked up and saw the boy he used to be, the one who would hide behind my skirts when the thunder grew too loud, the one who cried when he scraped his knee because he knew my kiss was the only thing that could make the world right again. His eyes were glassy, anchored in a mixture of profound gratitude and the heavy, lingering shadow of his father's funeral 3 years ago. "It's okay, Jared," I whispered, my voice a low rasp that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. "Your father always wanted this for you. He wanted you to have a roof that was yours, a place where your children could grow without the fear of the wind shaking the walls." I signed my name. The ink flowed black and permanent, biting into the paper with a finality that made my heart thud once, hard against my ribs. I slid the check across the table. It glided over the mahogany surface like a ship launching into uncertain waters. For a moment it sat there, a white rectangular bridge between my past and their future. "This is not charity, Jared," I said, my gaze shifting from my son to the woman sitting beside him. I made sure my voice held the resonance of authority, the quiet strength of a woman who knew exactly what she was giving away. "This is an investment in your marriage, in your future, and in the continuity of our family. But you must understand one thing. A house built with this money is a house where honor lives. My voice will not be silenced in the home that this sacrifice builds." Jared leaned forward, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. His skin was warm, his grip desperate. "Mom, you've done more than anyone could ever ask. You're not just helping us, you're saving us." I promise you, you will never feel like an outsider. This is your home as much as ours. He believed it. In that moment, with the tears finally spilling over his lower lashes, he truly believed it. He saw a future where I was the matriarch, the honored guest, the keeper of the stories. But then I looked at Erica. She hadn't spoken, but her silence was a language all its own. She reached out, her hand moving with a predatory grace, and picked up the check. She didn't look at Jared. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were locked on the numbers. I watched the way her pupils dilated, the way a faint triumphant flush crept up her neck, disappearing into the collar of her silk blouse. When she finally looked up, she wore a smile. It was a masterpiece of social engineering, symmetrical, bright, and utterly hollow. It was a porcelain smile, beautiful to look at but brittle enough to shatter if you applied the slightest pressure. It was the smile of a victor who had just secured a strategic territory. "Thank you, Linda," she said. Her voice was as sweet as iced tea. But there was a chill at the bottom of the glass that didn't come from ice. "This means everything to us. We've wanted that colonial in Greenwich for so long. You've truly given us the life we deserve. The life we deserve." The phrasing struck a discordant note in my soul, like a cracked bell ringing in a cathedral. She didn't say the life we worked for or the life we dreamt of. She said deserve. As if the universe owed her this white-pillared sanctuary, and I was merely the delivery mechanism for her destiny. I felt a sudden sharp pang of coldness in the center of my chest, a premonition that flickered like a candle in a draft. I looked at the way her manicured thumb brushed over my signature, almost as if she were trying to rub the name away, to erase the source so she could claim the result as her own. "The closing is next Thursday," the attorney interrupted, his professional tone cutting through the emotional tension like a blade. "Once the bank receives these funds, the title will be processed. Linda, as we discussed, your name will remain as a primary stakeholder on the deed until the final mortgage balance is cleared." Erica's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a glitch in the matrix of her composure. "Of course," she said, her voice tightening ever so slightly. "It's only fair for now." I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my black suit jacket. I felt older than I had when I walked into the room an hour ago. I felt lighter too, but it wasn't the lightness of freedom. It was the lightness of something hollowed out. I had given them the keys to a kingdom, and in doing so, I had stripped myself of my own armor. As we walked out of the office, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind us, Jared wrapped his arm around my shoulders. He smelled like the cologne David used to wear, a scent that always made me want to lean into him and weep. "I love you, Mom," he whispered into my hair. "I love you too, son," I replied. I watched them walk toward their car, Jared with his head held a little higher, and Erica, who was already on her phone, likely scrolling through interior design websites, her movements quick and possessive. She was already mentally painting over my memories, knocking down the walls of my influence, and replacing my presence with cleaner looks and modern boundaries. I stood on the sidewalk, the afternoon sun feeling strangely cold on my skin. I had just signed away a fortune to ensure my son's happiness. I had planted a tree so they could sit in its shade. But as I watched the taillights of their car disappear into the city traffic, a terrifying thought took root in my mind. Some people don't want the shade of the tree. They just want the wood to build a fence to keep the gardener out. I touched my chest, where the ghost of that heavy fountain pen still seemed to rest. I had given them my heart in ink. I only prayed they wouldn't make me bleed to get it back. The sun over Greenwich that morning was too bright, a clinical, unforgiving glare that made the pristine white siding of the colonial house look like polished bone. It was a beautiful day, the kind poets write about: crisp air, a sky the color of a robin's egg, and the scent of freshly mown grass lingering like a sweet perfume. But as I stood on the curb, my coat buttoned tight against a breeze that felt sharper than it should have, I realized that beauty can be a mask. This house, with its towering pillars and emerald lawn, was a masterpiece of architectural grace. Yet, to me, it felt like a mirage, a shimmering promise of family unity that was already beginning to dissolve the moment we stepped onto the gravel driveway. The scene was a chaotic ballet of productivity. Massive white moving trucks lined the street, their hydraulic ramps groaning under the weight of lives being transplanted. Movers, their foreheads beaded with sweat despite the morning chill, navigated the narrow path with heavy boxes labeled kitchen, fragile and master bedroom linens. In the center of the storm stood Jared. He was radiant. I hadn't seen him look this alive in years. He was wearing an old university sweatshirt, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows, helping carry a stack of chairs. When he caught my eye, he flashed a grin that mirrored the boyish excitement of his childhood birthdays. "Look at this place, Mom!" he shouted over the rumble of a truck engine. "Can you believe it? It's ours. We're finally here." Ours. The word was a warm blanket, and for a fleeting second, I allowed myself to be wrapped in it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the $200,000 I had signed away was the price of admission into this joy. But as quickly as the warmth came, it was extinguished by the sight of Erica. If Jared was the heart of the moving day, Erica was its cold, calculating brain. She didn't look like someone moving into a new home. She looked like a general overseeing the occupation of a conquered territory. Clad in a crisp beige trench coat and holding a digital tablet like a weapon, she directed the movers with a clipped, surgical efficiency. Her voice was a low, steady hum of commands. "No please, no thank you, only coordinates and directives. No, not there. 3 inches to the left. The light from the foyer needs to hit the grain of the floor perfectly," she told 2 men struggling with a heavy armoire. She didn't look at them as human beings. They were merely tools to realize her vision. And then they brought it out, the walnut sideboard. My heart gave a small, painful hitch. I had spent months searching for that piece. It was an antique I discovered in a dusty little shop off the post road. A hand-carved relic from an era when things were built to last lifetimes. I had bought it as a surprise for them, thinking of the Sunday roasts and holiday dinners that would be served atop its dark, rich wood. To me, that sideboard was an anchor, a piece of my soul offered to their new life. "Careful with that," I called out instinctively as the movers tilted it to clear the door frame. Erica turned. Her gaze didn't soften when it landed on me. It was a look of profound, weary tolerance. "It's fine, Linda," she said, her voice like a thin sheet of ice cracking underfoot. "We've got it under control. Actually, I was thinking, maybe the sideboard is a bit much for the dining room. It's very heavy, isn't it? It feels a bit dated against the minimalist aesthetic we're going for." The words felt like a slap. Dated. I looked at the intricate carvings, the way the sunlight caught the deep amber hues of the wood. Wood that David and I had once talked about as the kind of quality our grandchildren would one day touch. "It's an heirloom, Erica," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's meant to bring warmth to the room." "Warmth is just another word for clutter sometimes," she replied, her eyes already darting back to her tablet. "We'll put it in the hallway for now. Out of the way. Out of the way." The phrase echoed in my mind as I watched them haul my gift into the shadows of the secondary corridor. It wasn't just the furniture they were pushing aside. It was the woman who had made the room possible. As the hours ticked by, the walls began to rise. Not the physical ones of timber and drywall, but invisible barriers made of glances, silences, and our language. I tried to help, reaching for a box of crystal glasses, but Erica was there in an instant, her hand firm on the cardboard. "I've got a system, Linda. It's better if you just enjoy the view. Why don't you go sit on the porch? The movers need the hallways clear." I found myself retreated to the front steps, a trespasser on my own investment. I sat on the cold stone watching the neighborhood. Greenwich was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt expensive. The houses were spaced perfectly apart, hidden behind manicured hedges and iron gates. It was a place designed for privacy, for boundaries. Whispered warnings to anyone who didn't belong. From inside the house I heard the sound of laughter. It was Erica's voice, bright and melodic, joined by the deeper baritone of her father, Mr. Wilson, who had just arrived. I hadn't even realized they were there. I stood up and peered through the large bay window. The scene inside was a tableau of a family I wasn't part of. Erica was showing her parents the kitchen, the marble island I had funded, the custom cabinetry I had authorized. Mrs. Wilson was running a hand over the stone, nodding in approval. They looked like they belonged there. They looked like the rightful owners of the space. Jared was with them, showing his father-in-law the view of the backyard. Not once did any of them look toward the front door where I stood. Not once did Jared call out, "Mom, come see this." A cold, hollow sensation settled in the pit of my stomach. I realized that in their minds the transaction was complete. The money had been harvested, the check had been cashed, and the benefactor was now a ghost, a lingering spirit from a previous life that was no longer required for the haunting. I looked at my hands. They felt thin, frail in the harsh Greenwich light. I had given them the foundation, thinking it would keep us all together. I had thought that by providing the soil, I would be allowed to help tend the garden. But Erica wasn't looking for a gardener. She was looking for a blank slate, and I was the only ink left on the page that she couldn't wait to erase. I stood on the curb as the sun began to dip, casting long skeletal shadows across the emerald lawn. The moving trucks were packing up, their mission accomplished. Jared came out to say goodbye, his face flushed with the exhaustion of a successful day. "You okay, Mom? You look a bit tired," he said, giving me a quick, distracted hug. "I'm fine, Jared," I lied. The words tasted like ash. "The house is. It's everything you wanted. It really is," he breathed, looking back at the white colonial with a look of pure adoration. "Erica has so many plans. She's already talking about repainting the guest room for her parents' visit next month." He didn't mention a room for me. He didn't mention a key. He didn't even notice that I was standing on the outside of the gate, while his new life was unfolding behind the heavy brass-handled door. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, already turning back toward the house before I had even reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling, watching the front door close with a heavy final thud. The white colonial stood there, magnificent and mocking. It was a mirage of a home, a beautiful shell that contained everything I loved, but offered me no entry. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The lights were coming on inside, warm and inviting, but they weren't shining for me. I was the ghost haunting the perimeter, and the walls were already higher than I ever imagined they could be. The air in the house was thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive wax, a fragrance Erica called Midnight Garden, though to me it smelled like a funeral for a past I hadn't quite finished mourning. It was the night of the housewarming party, a choreographed performance of success designed to announce their arrival in the upper echelons of Greenwich society. The white colonial, once a hollow shell of my husband's savings, had been transformed into a gleaming stage. Every corner was illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that cast a warm, deceptive glow over the rooms, making everything look effortless, as if the house had simply sprouted from the earth by the sheer will of its inhabitants. I had dressed with a quiet, trembling care. I wore a charcoal silk dress, the one David had bought for our 30th anniversary, and a string of pearls that felt like cold, heavy raindrops against my collarbone. I wanted to look the part of the proud mother, the matriarch who had laid the cornerstone of this empire. But as I stepped through the front door, the very door I had unlocked with the power of my signature, I felt a sudden sharp displacement. It was as if I were stepping into a photograph of a life that didn't belong to me. The foyer was filled with people I didn't recognize. Men in tailored blazers and women with skin pulled tight by vanity and wealth. They laughed in a way that sounded like crystal breaking, sharp and expensive. I moved through the crowd, a phantom in silk, nodding at faces that looked right through me. Eventually, I found my way to the kitchen, the heartbeat of the home. I stood by the granite countertops, a magnificent slab of Bianco Antico, veined with silver and charcoal. I remembered the day I sat in the stone yard, shivering in the damp air, touching the cold surface and thinking, Jared will love this. He'll make coffee here. He'll toast to his future here. I had paid the invoice for this stone without a second thought, a $15,000 gift to ensure their mornings were beautiful. Now Erica was holding court over that very stone. She was draped in a cream-colored jumpsuit, a glass of vintage Bollinger held loosely in her hand. She looked radiant, her eyes glittering with the predatory sparkle of a woman who knew she was being admired. "We really wanted something that felt authentic," Erica said, her voice carrying easily over the low hum of the jazz music. She was speaking to a couple, the Harringtons I think, who lived 3 doors down. It took so much soul-searching to find the right property. We didn't want a handout, we wanted a project. Something we could call our own from the ground up. I felt the air leave my lungs. Project? A ground-up effort? I tightened my grip on my wine glass, the stem feeling perilously thin. "The renovations were grueling," Erica continued, her smile widening as she leaned into Jared, who stood beside her like a silent sentinel. "But Jared and I were adamant. We wanted this house to represent our independence. Every tile, every light fixture, every choice was ours. It's so empowering to know that we built this life through our own vision and hard work. The Harringtons nodded, their faces full of the benign respect reserved for self-made young couples. It's a rarity these days, Mr. Harrington said, clinking his glass against Erica's. Most kids your age are still leaning on the bank of mom and dad. It's refreshing to see a couple stand on their own 2 feet. Not once did Erica look at me. Not once did my name cross her lips. I was standing less than 3 feet away, the literal architect of their financial freedom, and I had been rendered invisible. I was a prop in the background of her independent play, a vestigial organ of a family history she was determined to excise. The $200,000 I had provided was not a gift to her. It was a debt she intended to repay with silence. I looked at Jared. My son. My boy. He caught my eye across the expanse of the granite. For a heartbeat, the mask of the successful young husband slipped. I saw the flash of guilt in his eyes, the flickering shadow of the man who knew he was living a lie. He looked at me with a silent, apologetic thank you. A gaze that tried to bridge the chasm Erica was widening. It was a look that begged for my forgiveness, that asked me to play along, to let them have this moment of unearned glory. But it was too weak. His silence was a roar of betrayal. By not speaking up, by not saying, actually we couldn't have done this without my mother. He was complicit in my erasure. He was allowing her to bury me alive under the weight of her ambition. Susan dear, you look lovely, a voice chirped. It was Mrs. Wilson, Erica's mother. She swept toward me, smelling of gin and expensive perfume. She didn't look at me so much as she inspected me for flaws. Doesn't the house look magnificent? Erica has worked herself to the bone. I told her, darling, you've earned this. You deserve every inch of this success. I'm sure she does, I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle like old parchment. Though success usually has many parents. Mrs. Wilson's eyes narrowed, a coldness settling into her expression. Oh, we all play our parts, I suppose. But at the end of the day, it's their names on the mailbox, isn't it? That's what truly matters. She patted my arm, a condescending, dismissive gesture, and fluttered away to join the circle around her daughter. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo. The room began to spin, the laughter of the guests turning into a discordant screech. I realized then that this wasn't a celebration of a new home. It was a coronation. Erica was the queen, Jared was the prince consort, and I was the dowager who had been sent to the tower to rot in gilded silence. I looked back at the granite. I had paid for it, but I wasn't allowed to rest my hand upon it without feeling like an intruder. I had paid for the walls, but they were designed to keep me out. I had paid for the warmth, but I was shivering in the cold. I didn't finish my wine. I placed the glass on the edge of the counter I had bought, and turned toward the door. As I moved through the foyer, I saw Erica again, her head thrown back in a triumphant laugh. She looked like a woman who had never known a day of struggle in her life. She looked like a woman who believed her own lies. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of water. The sounds of the party became a dull, muffled thud behind the heavy oak door. I stood there for a long time, looking out at the dark, silent street. I had given them everything, thinking it would buy me a seat at the table. I had thought that generosity was a bridge. I was wrong. In the world Erica was building, generosity was just a weakness to be exploited, and a mother's love was a resource to be mined until it was dry. As I walked down the steps to my car, I felt the first real crack in my heart. It wasn't the kind of break that bleeds, it was the kind that turns to stone. I was a ghost at their feast, but ghosts have a way of haunting the houses they built. As I drove away, leaving the lights of the white colonial behind, I realized that a house built on a lie is a house made of glass. And glass, no matter how expensive, is very easy to shatter. The morning following the housewarming was draped in a muted silver light, the kind of gray that makes the world feel like an old photograph fading at the edges. I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that no amount of sleep could dissolve. My charcoal silk dress lay draped over the velvet chair in the corner of my bedroom, a dark reminder of the night I had spent being a ghost in a house I had built with my own blood and history. The pearls sat on my nightstand dull and cold, looking less like jewelry and more like a string of frozen tears. I moved through my own house, a modest, warm space filled with the scent of lavender and the echoing silence of David's absence, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I went to the kitchen to perform the morning ritual that usually anchored me. I filled the copper tea kettle, the water splashing against the metal with a hollow rhythmic thud. Then the vibration came. It wasn't a loud sound, just a brief, insistent hum against the granite of the kitchen island. My phone's screen ignited, cutting through the morning gloom with a clinical blue glare. I wiped my damp hands on my apron and picked it up, expecting a message of gratitude, perhaps a lingering thank you for the party, or a son's tender inquiry into how I had slept. Instead, I found a sentence that felt like a guillotine blade. "We'll keep the spare key. Erica's parents will use the guest room." The sender was Jared. But the voice? The voice was entirely Erica's. I stared at the screen until the words began to blur into a jagged, incomprehensible mess. There was no "Good morning, Mom." There was no "We loved having you last night." There was not even the basic courtesy of a preamble. It was a directive. A legal notice disguised as a family update. In 14 words, I had been systematically evicted from the very sanctuary I had financed. The spare key, the small brass symbol of trust and belonging I had been carrying on my ring since the day of the closing, was now being demanded back. Not through a conversation, not through a heartfelt explanation of boundaries, but through a digital cold shoulder. And the guest room. The room I had secretly imagined decorating with a few of my favorite quilts. The room where I thought I would sleep on Christmas Eve so I could wake up and make pancakes for my son. It had been reallocated before the paint was even dry. Behind me, the tea kettle began to hum. It started as a low guttural vibration, a simmering resentment that mirrored the heat rising in my own throat. Erica's parents. The Wilsons. The people who had arrived with empty hands and took up the most space. They were being welcomed into the heart of the home, while I was being relegated to the status of a distant, occasionally tolerated visitor. The kettle's hum ascended into a whistle, a sharp, piercing shriek that cut through the silence of the house like a physical blow. It was a shrill mirror to the scream building in my chest, a sound born of 40 years of motherhood suddenly being rendered obsolete. I reached out and turned off the stove. The sudden silence that followed was even more violent than the whistle. I sat down on the kitchen stool, the phone still glowing in my hand. It was then, in the stark clarity of that lonely kitchen, that the truth finally crystallized, sharp and unforgiving. To them, or perhaps specifically to the woman who now held my son's heart in a velvet-lined fist, I was not a mother. I was not a matriarch. I was not even a friend. I was an ATM. I was a source of liquid capital that had served its purpose. I was a foundation stone that was now expected to remain buried, silent and invisible, while they built their glittering life on top of me. They didn't want my presence. They wanted my absence, provided that my money remained exactly where they had placed it. The realization was a cold, visceral ache. I thought of the $200,000. I thought of the countless hours I had spent worrying about Jared's future. The nights I had stayed up calculating how to give him the world without making him feel the weight of the debt. I had tried to give him wings, but it seemed he had used them to fly as far away from me as possible, led by a navigator who viewed my love as an obstacle to her autonomy. Independence. The word Erica had used at the party returned to mock me. They weren't independent. They were merely ungrateful. They wanted the fruit of the tree without having to acknowledge the gardener. I looked at the spare key on my counter, the one I had planned to bring over today with a small housewarming gift. It felt heavy now, ornamental and useless, like a charm for a door that had been boarded up. It was a souvenir of a relationship that was being systematically dismantled by boundaries that felt more like a prison wall. My fingers hovered over the screen. I wanted to roar. I wanted to type out the history of my sacrifices. I wanted to remind Jared of the boy who used to hold my hand when he was scared. But I knew that words were no longer the currency they traded in. Erica had turned our family into a transaction, and in her ledger, I was a debt that had already been settled. I took a deep breath, the steam from the now silent kettle dampening my face. I didn't type a paragraph. I didn't send a plea. I replied with a single clinical thumbs-up emoji. It was the modern etiquette for the defeated. It was a white flag raised in a digital war I hadn't realized I was fighting. But as I set the phone down, the grief in my heart began to shift. The sorrow, so heavy and wet, began to dry into something harder. Something sharper. If I was truly just an ATM to them, then perhaps it was time they learned what happens when the account is frozen. If they wanted to treat our relationship like a contract, then I would start reading the fine print. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't pour the tea. I didn't need the warmth anymore. I walked to my study, my eyes fixed on the bottom drawer of my desk where the house documents lived. They had given me a sentence, the sentence of the spare key. They had told me I was no longer welcome in the house my signature had bought. They thought they had closed the door on me. But as I pulled out the thick, cream-colored folder labeled Greenwich Property, I felt a grim, silent resolve. They had forgotten one very important thing about doors. The person who pays for the house is the one who chooses who holds the keys. I was no longer just Linda, the grieving mother. I was Linda Miller, the woman who knew exactly how much every brick in that house cost. And if they wanted to play at being independent, I was more than happy to let them see exactly how much independence costs without my shadow to keep them cool. The drive to Greenwich felt longer than usual, the road stretching out like a fraying ribbon beneath my tires. My heart was a frantic bird, thumping against the cage of my ribs with a rhythm that bordered on painful. I tried to tell myself I was being sensitive, that a mother's intuition is often just a fancy word for paranoia, but the weight of that spare key text sat in my purse like a cold stone. I wasn't going there to fight. I was going there to breathe, to see my son, and to remind myself that the walls I had paid for were still standing. As I pulled into the driveway, the white Colonial stood as magnificent as ever, bathed in the soft gold of the afternoon sun. It looked like a postcard of the American dream. But as I stepped out of the car, a strange chill swept over the lawn. The air felt thin, sterilized. I didn't use my key. Something stayed my hand, a sudden sharp instinct that the lock might already have a mind of its own. I rang the doorbell instead. The chimes echoed inside, a hollow melodic sound that seemed to travel through an empty cathedral. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Jared who stood there. It was Erica. She was dressed in an oversized cashmere sweater, her hair perfectly tousled in that way that takes hours to achieve. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give a solicitor you're about to turn away, polite, distant, and entirely closed. "Linda," she said, her voice a smooth, clinical hum. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting company today." "I was just in the neighborhood," I lied, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. "I thought I'd drop off those linen napkins I mentioned, and to see how the settling in is going." I stepped past her into the foyer, and the breath left my lungs in a silent, jagged gasp. The foyer was different. The space where the walnut sideboard had stood, the heavy hand-carved anchor of my family's history, was now occupied by a sleek skeletal console made of brushed gold and white marble. It was trendy, soulless, and looked like it had been plucked from the window of a department store. My sideboard, the piece David and I had found together, the piece that held the scent of lemon oil and 40 years of memories, was gone. "Where is it?" I whispered, my hand reaching out to touch the cold marble of the new console. "The sideboard. Where did you put it?" Erica didn't even blink. "Oh, that old thing? We moved it to the garage for now. It was just too heavy for the space, Linda. It blocked the flow of the light. We wanted something more us. Something cleaner." Cleaner. As if my history were a stain she was trying to scrub away. I walked into the living room, my feet feeling heavy on the indigo rug I had chosen, only to find that the rug was gone too. In its place was a sea of beige and cream, a room so devoid of color it felt like a hospital wing. And there, anchored on the sofa like royalty on a throne, were the Wilsons. Mr. Wilson sat with his feet up on the ottoman I had paid for, holding the remote control with the casual ease of a man who owned the air he breathed. Mrs. Wilson had a magazine open on her lap, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. They looked up as I entered, and for a fleeting second, I saw it in their eyes, pity. It wasn't the pity you feel for a friend in grief. It was the polite, condescending pity one reserves for a distant, slightly confused relative who has wandered into the wrong room. "Hello, Linda," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice dripping with a saccharine kindness that made my skin crawl. "We were just settling in. The guest room is simply adorable, though we did have to move that fussy little armchair out. No back support at all, you know." At our age, one must be practical. I felt a surge of heat rise in my throat. That fussy little chair was the one I used to sit in when I read to Jared. It was the one I had imagined sitting in while I watched my future grandchildren play on the floor. I loved that chair, I said, my voice trembling. I chose every piece in this house with a purpose. I chose them for family. Erica stepped into the room, her presence like a sudden drop in temperature. She didn't look at her parents. She looked directly at me, her eyes narrowing into two sharp points of flint. Linda, we appreciate everything you've done, she began, her tone shifting from clinical to predatory. But we've talked about this. This is our house now. We need it to reflect our style, our life. Not yours. Our house. I repeated, the irony tasting like copper in my mouth. Erica, I am the reason this roof is over your head. I am the reason you aren't living in a 2-bedroom rental in the city. I didn't give you this money so you could erase me. Jared came into the room then, a mug of coffee in each hand. He stopped when he saw me, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. Mom? I didn't know you were coming over. Clearly, I said, looking at my son, searching for a trace of the boy who used to defend me. Jared, tell her, Erica said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. Jared looked at the floor, then at his wife, then finally at me. He looked like a man being pulled apart by two different tides. Mom, we just need some space. To be a family. On our own. You are a family, I whispered. I am your mother. These people, I gestured to the Wilsons who were watching the scene with a detached, smug curiosity, are living in the guest room I paid for. And you're telling me I'm the one who needs to give you space? Erica took a step toward me. She didn't scream. She didn't have to. The quietness of her voice was more violent than a shout. This is our house, Linda, she said, delivering each word like a legal verdict. Please respect our boundaries. The word boundaries felt like a barbed wire fence being erected in the middle of my heart. It was a word designed to sound healthy and modern, but in her mouth it was a weapon. It was a way to tell me that my love was a trespass, that my generosity was a burden, and that my presence was an intrusion. I looked at the room, the pale, sterile beige room where my memories used to live. I looked at the Wilsons, who had claimed the comfort I had provided. I looked at my son, who stood silent and broken, holding 2 mugs of coffee for people who hadn't contributed a single cent to the floor they stood on. I realized then that they weren't just redecorating. They were performing an exorcism. They were trying to cast out the ghost of the woman who had made their life possible, so they could pretend they had done it all themselves. I see, I said, my voice finally steadying into a cold, hard clarity. I'll leave you to your boundaries. I turned and walked out. I didn't look back at the walnut sideboard in the garage. I didn't look at the empty foyer. I walked out into the Greenwich sun, which no longer felt warm. As I got into my car, I could see them through the front window. Erica was laughing at something her father said. Mrs. Wilson was turning a page in her magazine. Jared was closing the blinds, shutting out the light, shutting out me. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They thought they had one. They thought that by changing the locks and the furniture, they had changed the reality of the situation. But as I looked up at the white Colonial, a new thought began to take shape. A cold surgical thought. Erica wanted me to respect her boundaries? Fine. I would respect them. But boundaries work both ways. If they wanted to live in a house that was entirely theirs, then they could start by paying for it. All of it. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires like breaking glass. I was no longer the grieving mother looking for a place at the table. I was a woman who had been erased, and I was about to show them exactly what happens when the foundation decides it no longer wants to hold up the house. The Wilsons could have the guest room for now, but they had better enjoy the back support of that sofa while they could, because in 30 days the bank wouldn't care about Erica's cleaner look, and neither would I. The invitation arrived not as a warm gesture of reconciliation, but as a hurried afterthought, a jagged crumb tossed to a beggar at the gates. Jared's voice over the phone had been clipped, vibrating with the frantic energy of a man trying to manage a schedule that was no longer his own. Erica's hosting her parents tonight, Mom, she thought. Well, we both thought you might like to come too. Just a casual thing. 7 o'clock. There was no "we miss you." There was no "please come." It was an obligatory box to be checked, a social tax they were paying to keep the peace. Yet, like a fool anchored by a mother's hope, I went. I dressed in a soft, navy wool dress, pinned David's favorite silver brooch to my lapel, and drove back to the white Colonial, telling myself that perhaps the dinner table could be a neutral ground. Perhaps over the breaking of bread, the boundaries would soften into something resembling family. I was wrong. The air inside the house was no longer the air of a home. It was the atmosphere of a high-end showroom, sterile and curated to the point of suffocation. The table was set with a precision that felt hostile, linens folded into sharp, origami-like triangles, crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier like rows of icy teeth. Erica floated through the dining room in a silk-wrapped dress, the perfect hostess, her movements as fluid and calculated as a dancer's. Her parents, the Wilsons, were already seated, their wine glasses half empty, their laughter filling the space with a proprietary booming that suggested they had lived there for decades. "Ah, Linda," Mr. Wilson barked, barely looking up from his Cabernet. "Good of you to join the party. We were just admiring the crown molding. Erica has such an eye for detail, doesn't she? A real visionary." I sat down in the chair Jared pulled out for me. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked thinner, the light in his gaze replaced by a haunted, flickering exhaustion. He looked like a man who was spending every waking hour trying to please a goddess who demanded nothing less than total devotion. The meal was a parade of expensive, tasteless things. A truffle risotto that felt like sand in my mouth. A roast that smelled of rosemary and resentment. For the first hour I was a ghost at the feast. They talked over me, around me, through me. They discussed the neighborhood association, the upcoming gala at the yacht club, and the magnificent kitchen renovations. Then the first strike came. Mr. Wilson stood up, his glass raised, his face flushed with the smug satisfaction of a man who had successfully colonized someone else's territory. "A toast," he announced, his voice echoing off the walls I had paid for. "To Erica and Jared. To this incredible house and, more importantly, to their independence. It is a rare thing to see a young couple today who truly understands the value of standing on their own 2 feet. No handouts, no safety nets. Just pure, unadulterated hard work and vision. To your new life, kids. May it always be entirely yours." Clink. The sound of the glasses meeting was like a series of small, sharp gunshots. I sat frozen, my hands clasped in my lap, the blood rushing to my ears in a deafening roar. No handouts? No safety nets? The $200,000 check felt like it was burning a hole in the memory of that attorney's office. The mortgage balance I was still carrying felt like a physical weight pressing down on the table. I looked at Erica. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes meeting mine over the rim of the glass with a look of pure, icy triumph. She wasn't just accepting the toast, she was savoring the lie. "Let's not forget how this all began," I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a rusted blade. It was softer than I intended, but the table went instantly silent. Erica set her glass down with a slow, rhythmic thud. "I'm sorry, Linda. Did you say something?" I said. I repeated, my voice gaining a hard, crystalline edge, that we should perhaps acknowledge the foundation of this independence. It's easy to stand on your own 2 feet, when someone else has already built the floor beneath them. The silence that followed was visceral. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the designer clock in the hallway, the shallow, panicked breathing of my son. Erica's smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned into shards of flint. She leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in her pupils like tiny, controlled fires. "Susan," she said, using my formal name like a weapon, "we've had this conversation. We appreciate the assistance you provided during the transition. But that was a gift, wasn't it? And a gift doesn't buy you a seat at the head of our table. This is our life now, not yours. Our choices, our house, our rules. If you can't respect that, then perhaps you aren't ready to be a part of it." The words landed like gavels in a courtroom. Final. Irrefutable. Executionary. I turned to Jared. My heart was screaming for him. "Say something, Jared. Tell them. Tell them about your father's sweat. Tell them about the nights we saved. Tell them who I am." Jared sat in a deafening, soul-crushing silence. He was staring at his plate, His fork toyed with a piece of wilted arugula, his knuckles white. He looked like a coward. Worse, he looked like a stranger. The boy I had raised to be honorable, the man I had sacrificed everything for, was gone. In his place was a shell, a hollow vessel that had been filled with Erica's cold beige ambitions. His cowardice hurt more than Erica's cruelty. Her malice was expected. His silence was a betrayal that reached into the very marrow of my bones. "Jared," I whispered, a final plea. He didn't look up. "Mom, please. Don't make a scene. It's just dinner. It's just dinner." I felt something break inside me then. It wasn't a sharp snap, but a slow grinding disintegration. The scene wasn't the problem. The lie was the tragedy. I realized in that moment that my love had been mistaken for a weakness they could exploit. They viewed my generosity as a transaction that had already been closed, my presence as a debt they were tired of servicing. I stood up. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor. A harsh, discordant sound that felt like the only honest thing in the room. "Thank you for the meal," I said, my voice steady, though I felt as if I were standing on the deck of a sinking ship. It was illuminating. "Leaving so soon?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her voice dripping with a fake, patronizing concern. "We haven't even had the tart." "I've had quite enough," I replied. I walked out of the dining room, through the foyer with its soulless console, and out onto the porch. The night air hit me like a splash of ice water, shocking my system back into reality. I walked to my car, my heels clicking on the driveway I had paid for, the gravel crunching beneath my feet like the bones of the family I used to have. As I drove away, I looked back at the house in the rearview mirror. It was glowing, a beautiful white pillared line nestled in the shadows of Greenwich. Inside, they were likely laughing again, carving into the tart, toasts continuing to a future that didn't include me. I tasted dust and ash in the back of my throat, the dust of 40 years of motherhood blown away by a single icy wind. The ash of a bridge I had built with my own hands, now burned to the ground by the very people I had tried to carry across. But as the lights of the Colonial faded into the dark, the grief began to transform. The sorrow didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened. I realized that if they wanted to live in a world of independence and legal boundaries, then I would give them exactly what they asked for. They thought I was a weak, aging woman they could push into the shadows. They thought my love made me a victim. They forgot that the same hand that signs a check can also sign a foreclosure notice. I drove home in a silence that was no longer lonely, but calculated. The dinner of dust was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and shadows, the road ahead shimmering through a haze of unshed tears that I refused to let fall. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, the silence of my neighborhood felt heavy, almost suffocating. My house, the one David and I had filled with 3 decades of laughter, burnt toast, and the soft scuff of a growing boy's sneakers, greeted me with a quiet, hollow dignity. It didn't smell like expensive jasmine or midnight garden. It smelled of old books, lavender sachets, and the lingering ghostly scent of my husband's pipe tobacco. I walked through the front door, but I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every corner of this sanctuary by heart. I moved through the foyer, past the framed photos of a younger, smiling Jared, and headed straight for the back of the house. My study was a small wood-paneled room that had once been David's retreat, and was now my command center. It was here that we had planned our retirement, here that we had mapped out the legacy we wanted to leave for our only son. I sat at the heavy oak desk, the leather chair groaning softly as if acknowledging my fatigue. The dinner of dust still coated my tongue. I could still hear the clink of the Wilsons' glasses, the rhythmic thud of Erica's cold boundaries, and the deafening soul-crushing silence of my son. The betrayal wasn't just a bruise. It was an evisceration. They had taken my heart, used it as a stepping stone, and then told me I was no longer permitted to touch the ground. But Erica had made one fatal mistake. In her haste to erase me, in her arrogance to believe that a mother's love is a bottomless well that never demands a ledger, she had forgotten who I was before I was Susan, the inconvenient mother-in-law. I was Linda Miller. I had spent 20 years navigating the labyrinth of real estate law alongside David. I knew that in the world of property, emotion is a vapor, but ink is immutable. With hands that were finally, blessedly steady, I pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk. It stuck for a moment, resisting before sliding out with a metallic scrape. I reached into the back and pulled out the thick, cream-colored folder embossed with the seal of the Greenwich Title Company. The Ledger of Power. I clicked on the small green desk lamp, its pool of light casting long, dramatic shadows across the documents. I spread them out like a general preparing for a siege. Page after page of legalese, addendums, and notarized signatures began to fill the desk. I started with the deed. I traced my finger over the text, searching for the names. There it was. Linda S. Miller. Not as a witness, not as a guarantor, but as a primary title holder. In the flurry of the closing, amidst the champagne toasts and the frantic excitement of the kids, Erica had likely assumed that my $200,000 down payment was a simple gift, a wire transfer that vanished into the ether of their ownership. But I had insisted on the bridge financing structure. David's voice echoed in my mind, a gentle whisper from the past. Always keep a hand on the wheel, Linda. Not for control but for safety. The $200,000 I had paid at the table was merely the opening act, the earnest money that secured the fortress. But the remaining balance, the $600,000 mortgage that stood between them and true ownership, was a private loan structure tied directly to my authorization of the final disbursement from my husband's estate trust. I stared at the notice of final funding document. It was unsigned. The bank had issued a 30-day window for the final release of funds. If that signature didn't appear, the loan would fall into technical default. The independence Erica had toasted to was currently sitting on a precipice, held up by nothing more than the goodwill of the woman she had just told to respect her boundaries. A slow, cold warmth began to spread through my veins, replacing the icy chill of the dinner. It wasn't the heat of rage. It was the clinical, surgical warmth of resolve. They had built their white colonial fortress on my land. They had decorated it with my furniture, warmed it with my money, and filled its guest room with people who looked down on me. They had treated my presence as a trespass, my memories as clutter, and my son as a prize they had won in a war I didn't know we were fighting. Erica wanted boundaries? I would give her a boundary that was $600,000 wide and several stories high. I looked at the signature line on the deed once more. My name was etched there in black ink, a permanent mark on the history of that house. They could move the sideboard to the garage. They could replace the rug. They could shut the door in my face. But they could not remove the foundation without the whole structure collapsing into the dirt. This is our house, Susan. Her voice echoed in my mind, dripping with that porcelain venom. No, Erica. I whispered into the silence of the study, my voice a low, steady promise. It is my house. You are simply the tenants who forgot to say thank you. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes fixed on the unsigned funding authorization. The power I felt wasn't joyful. It was heavy and somber. It was the power of a mother who had realized that her child was being led into a wasteland of ingratitude. To save Jared, I would have to break the world Erica had built around him. I would have to show him that the independence he was so proud of was a house of cards, and that the person holding the fan was the mother he had allowed to be silenced. This wasn't vengeance for the sake of cruelty. It was education. It was a lesson in the architecture of respect. I had given freely, but I had not given up my dignity. And if they couldn't find it in their hearts to offer me a seat at the table, then they would find themselves without a table to sit at. I reached for the phone on my desk. My finger hovered over the contact for the bank representative, Mr. Henderson. I looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m. Too late to call, but not too late to decide. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me and began to draft a list. Not a grocery list or a list of holiday gifts, but a tactical outline. Halt the final disbursement. The $600,000 stays in the trust. Contact the locksmith. The weekend trip to the mountains is in 2 days. Issue the notice of default. 30 days to the reckoning. As I wrote the final point, the last traces of the dinner of dust seemed to vanish. I felt as if I were standing on solid ground for the first time since David's funeral. The heartbreak was still there. A dull, deep ache that I knew would never truly go away, but it was no longer the dominant force in my soul. I was no longer the ghost at the feast. I was the one who owned the hall. I stood up, tucked the folder under my arm and walked to the window. The moon was high over the trees, casting a silver light over my quiet garden. In 2 days, Jared and Erica would head to the mountains with the Wilsons, leaving their fortress in my care. They thought they were leaving behind a souvenir. They didn't realize they were leaving behind a lease they hadn't yet earned. I touched the glass, the cool surface grounding me. "I'm sorry, Jared," I whispered to the night air. "But you need to remember how it feels to have a mother who protects you, even if she has to protect you from your own mistakes." I turned off the desk lamp. The room plunged into darkness, but for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of the shadows. I walked to my bedroom, the heavy folder pressed against my chest like a shield. Tomorrow the bank would receive a phone call. And by Saturday, the white colonial in Greenwich would learn that a house is only a home when the foundation is respected. The keys were mine, and it was time to take them back. The departure of the white SUV from the gravel driveway at dawn felt like the lifting of a siege. I watched from the shadows of my own curtained window 3 blocks away, as my son, my daughter-in-law, and the Wilsons headed toward the mountains. It was a trip Jared had described with forced cheerfulness over a 30-second phone call, a much-needed escape to a luxury lodge in Vermont. The irony was a bitter pill that I swallowed without water. The very gasoline in that car, the leather of the seats, the prepaid reservations at a resort that cost more per night than I used to earn in a month, it was all an extension of the lifestyle I had provided. They were driving toward a weekend of independence, on a road paved with my husband's life insurance and my own quiet sacrifices. As the taillights vanished into the morning mist, I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. The time for weeping in the dark was over. The time for the ledger was here. I waited until 9 o'clock. Then I picked up the phone. The locksmith arrived in a nondescript white van, a man named Marcus with grease-stained cuticles and eyes that had seen 1,000 broken hearts and 1,000 more evicted dreams. He didn't ask questions. In the world of high-end real estate, a woman with the deed and a set of identification is simply a client, not a protagonist in a family tragedy. "All of them, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a low gravelly rumble as he looked at the imposing front door of the white colonial. "Every single one," I replied, my voice steadier than the pillars holding up the porch. "Front, back, side, and the garage. I want the old keys to be nothing more than jagged pieces of metal by the time you're done." He nodded, unzipping a heavy canvas bag that clattered with the tools of his trade. The sound of the first cylinder being stripped away was the most melodic thing I had heard in weeks. Scrape, click, thud. It was a surgical sound, a clinical deconstruction of the boundaries Erica had so smugly erected. With every turn of Marcus's screwdriver, I felt a layer of that suffocating dinner of dust being peeled away from my skin. Scrape, click, thud. There goes the front door, the one Erica stood behind when she told me I was a surprise guest. Scrape, click, thud. There goes the back door, the one I used to imagine walking through with bags of groceries and a heart full of stories for my grandchildren. I followed him from door to door, a silent witness to my own reclamation. As the old brass cylinders fell onto the hardwood floors, the floors I had paid for, they made a hollow ringing sound. To Marcus it was just scrap metal. To me it was a requiem. A funeral for the version of Linda Miller, who had begged for a seat at the table. A funeral for the mother who had allowed her silence to be bought with her own money. "You want me to rekey them to a master or separate?" Marcus asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "A master," I said. "One key for the whole world. And only I hold it." He moved to the side door, the one leading into the kitchen. I stood in the foyer, looking at the skeletal gold console that had replaced my walnut sideboard. In the silence of the empty house, the house smelled of the Wilsons' presence, a lingering scent of gin and expensive floral perfume. It felt like a desecrated sanctuary. I walked into the living room and sat on the beige sofa, the one where Mr. Wilson had sat like a king. I looked at my hands. They were no longer trembling. The coldness I had felt in the attorney's office had transformed into a suit of armor. I realized that for months, I had been mourning the loss of a son who was still alive, and the loss of a home I hadn't yet lived in. I had let them treat me like a ghost because I was afraid that if I made a sound I would lose them forever. But sitting there, listening to the rhythmic clink-clink of the locksmith's work, I realized I had already lost them. You cannot lose what isn't yours, and Jared had surrendered his loyalty long before I signed that check. To get him back, to save the man from the coward, I had to stop being the ghost. I had to become the wall. Done, ma'am, Marcus said, stepping back into the foyer. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small velvet-lined pouch. He tipped it over and 6 gleaming, silver-toned keys spilled onto the marble floor. They sparkled under the chandelier, bright and unforgiving. Picked one up. It was cold, the edges sharp and precise. As I closed my hand around it, the metal biting into my palm, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt since David died. Dignity. It wasn't a warm feeling. It was heavy like lead and sharp like a diamond. It was the weight of my own soul returning to my body. I wasn't just taking back a property. I was reclaiming the right to exist in the narrative of my own life. I was no longer an ATM or a background character. I was the owner. I was the foundation. And the foundation had just decided to move. Thank you, Marcus, I said, handing him a check, drawn from my personal account, not the trust. My pleasure. The old keys won't even turn the lock halfway now, he said, packing his tools. You're the only one with entry. After he left, I did something I hadn't done since the housewarming. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I used their expensive designer kettle, the one I had paid for, and sat at the marble island. The house felt different. The silence wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of a house waiting for its true master to speak. I walked to the guest room. The Wilson suitcases were gone, but their presence lingered in the form of a half-empty bottle of lotion on the nightstand and a magazine left face down on the bed. I didn't touch them. I simply closed the door and locked it from the outside. I then went to the garage. There, pushed into a dark corner and covered with a dusty tarp, was my walnut sideboard. I pulled the tarp back, the rough fabric scratching my skin. The wood was dull, neglected, but the carvings were still there, the intricate roses David had admired. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and wept. I wept for the husband who wasn't here to see this mess. I wept for the son who had forgotten the taste of honor. And I wept for the woman I had been, the one who thought love could be bought with a signature. But when I dried my eyes, the tears felt like the last of the autumn rain. I walked back to the front door, the master key glinting in the light. I stepped outside, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and heard the beautiful final click of the new bolt sliding into place. They were in the mountains, breathing the crisp air, laughing about their independence. They didn't know that the world they had built on my back had just been shuttered. They didn't know that the spare key in Erica's purse was now nothing more than a souvenir of a lie. I walked down the steps, my head held high. The white colonial stood behind me, a monument to my resolve. I wasn't just a mother-in-law. I wasn't just a widow. I was the woman who held the keys. And as I drove away, I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like the storm. The darkness inside the white colonial was not empty. It was a living, breathing thing, a velvet weight that pressed against the walls I had paid for. I sat in the high-backed armchair in the corner of the living room, the one Erica had called clutter, and waited. I didn't turn on a single lamp. I didn't need to. The moonlight filtered through the expensive linen shears, casting long skeletal fingers across the beige rug, turning the room into a sepulchre of unearned luxury. The house felt different tonight. It no longer smelled like Midnight Garden or the Wilsons' gin. It smelled of cold stone and the sharp, metallic tang of the new brass cylinders I had installed. It was a house in stasis, a fortress that had finally recognized its true sovereign. I sat in a vigil of silence, my hands resting on the cool leather of the chair, the master key tucked safely into the pocket of my cardigan. Then the stillness was shattered. Twin beams of light cut through the dark, sweeping across the ceiling like the searchlights of an invading army. I watched as the SUV crunched over the gravel of the driveway, the engine's low hum vibrating through the floorboards. I heard the car doors slam, for distinct thuds that echoed in the quiet Greenwich night. Laughter drifted toward the house. It was the tired, buoyant joy of travelers returning to what they believed was their sanctuary. I heard Mr. Wilson's booming baritone joking about the wine they brought back from the mountains, and Erica's melodic, triumphant giggle. They sounded like people who owned the world. They sounded like people who had forgotten that the ground beneath them was a gift. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I simply watched the shadow of the front door. The sound of the key hitting the lock was a sharp, discordant clink. I heard the fumbling, the jingle of the keychain, the one with the home sweet home fob I'd seen Erica buy. I heard the key slide into the keyway. And then the silence of the resistance. The key wouldn't turn. I could hear the metal straining against metal, the frantic rattle of a lock that refused to recognize its previous master. Jared, what are you doing? Give it here, Erica's voice snapped, the melody already fraying at the edges. I'm trying, Erica. It's stuck. Maybe the cold. Jared's voice was muffled, thick with the confusion of a man who had never had to fight for entry in his life. I sat in the dark, my heart thudding a slow rhythmic tattoo. Scrape, click, rattle. The sounds of their independence failing were more beautiful than any symphony. I let the silence of the house speak for me. I let the walls they had tried to erase me from stand as my witnesses. Move over, Erica commanded. I pictured her face, the porcelain mask cracking, the eyes narrowing. I heard the key bite into the lock again, more violent this time. Grind. Snap. This is ridiculous. Jared, did you change the locks and forget to tell me? Why would I change the locks, Erica? I've been with you the whole weekend. The confusion outside was turning into a palpable vibrating heat. I could hear them shifting on the porch, the heavy breathing of the Wilsons, the rustle of their expensive mountain gear. Maybe it's jammed from the inside? Mrs. Wilson suggested, her voice high and fluttering with a sudden, sharp anxiety. Is there a light on? I thought I saw a shadow. The pounding began then. It wasn't a knock. It was a frantic, rhythmic assault on the heavy oak. Thud, thud, thud. The vibration traveled through the floor and into the soles of my feet. It felt like the house was shivering under the weight of their entitlement. Open the door. Erica screamed. The polished hostess was gone. The woman who had toasted to her own autonomy was replaced by a creature of pure, raw panic. Jared, call the police. Someone is in our house. Open this door. This is our house. Our house. The words hit the dark room and shattered like glass. I closed my eyes, a single hot tear finally tracing a path down my cheek. I wasn't crying because I was winning. I was crying because of the sheer monumental waste of it all. I had given them a kingdom, and they had turned it into a battleground. They had built a sandcastle on the edge of a rising tide, and were now screaming at the ocean for being wet. I remained seated. I didn't answer. I let the silence teach them the lesson that my words never could. I let them feel the coldness of the boundaries they had so cherished. I let them stand on the outside of the door, looking in at the dark, realizing that their ownership was nothing more than a lease signed in disappearing ink. The shouting continued for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. I heard Jared's voice rise, heavy with a desperate, cracking authority. Mom? Mom, are you in there? Please. What is going on? The desperation in his voice almost broke me. For a second, the mother in me wanted to stand up, turn on the lights, and tell him everything was okay. But I knew that if I did, he would never grow. If I opened the door now, I would be validating his cowardice, confirming that he could betray me and still come home to a warm bed. The pounding eventually died down into a frantic, hushed argument. The mailbox, I heard Mr. Wilson mutter. Check the mailbox. Maybe there's a note. I heard the gravel crunch as they moved toward the end of the driveway. I stood up then, moving silently to the window, pulling the sheer aside just an inch. In the pale glow of the street lamp I saw them. They were huddled around the black metal mailbox like survivors around a dying fire. Erica's hands were trembling as she pulled out the stack of envelopes. I knew exactly what she was holding. I had spent the afternoon ensuring the bank's notices were the first thing they would see. The red stamps were visible even from the window. Notice of default. Final warning. Foreclosure pending. I watched as the color drained from Erica's face, her skin turning the same sickly white as the siding of the house. I watched as Jared took the papers from her, his shoulders slumping, his head dropping as the weight of reality finally crushed the independence out of him. The $600,000 balance they had ignored, the funding I had halted, the legal fiction of their ownership, it was all there, laid bare in cold black and white. The Wilsons stood behind them, their luggage at their feet, looking like discarded props from a play that had been cancelled mid-act. They weren't royalty anymore. They were just four people standing on a cold sidewalk in Greenwich, realizing that the fortress they had claimed was built on a foundation of air. Erica looked up at the house, her eyes scanning the dark windows. She looked small. She looked defeated. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that respect is not something you demand but something you earn. I let the sheer fall back into place. I walked back to my chair and sat down in the dark. The silence was absolute now. The shouting had stopped. The pounding had ceased. There was only the sound of the wind in the maples and the quiet, steady ticking of my own heart. I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a mother who had just had to break her child's arm to keep him from falling off a cliff. It was a heavy, sorrowful victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Tonight, they would sleep in a hotel, or perhaps on the Wilsons' floor. They would spend the night realizing that the world does not owe them a colonial house, and that a mother's love is not a blank check. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of the master key. The sandcastle had crumbled. The tide had come in. And for the first time in months, I felt as if I could finally sleep. The house was mine again. And tomorrow we would see if there was enough left of the sun I raised to build something that wouldn't wash away. The attorney's office felt smaller than it had the day I signed the first check. Perhaps it was because the air was no longer inflated with the airy, hollow promises of a bright future. The scent was the same, the expensive, heavy aroma of lemon-polished mahogany, and the dry, clinical dust of 1,000 legal precedents, but the temperature had dropped into a subarctic stillness. We sat around the same oak table, a vast, dark expanse of wood that felt less like a piece of furniture, and more like a battlefield where the casualties were measured in memories and bloodlines. I sat at the head of the table, flanked by my attorney, Ms. Grant. She was a woman of sharp bobbed hair and even sharper instincts, her presence a suit of armor I had finally allowed myself to wear. Across from me, the tableau was a study in disintegration. Erica sat perched on the edge of her leather chair, her fingers digging into the upholstery with such force that her knuckles were white, bloodless peaks. The porcelain smile, that masterpiece of social engineering she had worn like a mask, was gone, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her eyes were rimmed with a frantic, sleepless red, and she looked like a caged bird that had spent the last 48 hours bruising its wings against the bars of a reality she couldn't manipulate. Beside her sat Jared, my son, my only child. He looked like a man who had been pulled from the wreckage of a long, dark dream. His hair was unkempt, his gaze anchored to the grain of the wood as if searching for a hidden map back to the person he used to be. The radiant, independent man of the housewarming party had vanished, replaced by a hollowed-out version of the boy I used to hold. He looked as if he were waking up in a room where the walls were closing in, realizing for the first time that the air he was breathing was a gift he had tried to steal. And by the door the Wilsons hovered. They weren't royalty today. They were merely bystanders, their faces etched with an indignant, sputtering horror. They looked like people who had accidentally boarded a ship that was now listing 45 degrees into a cold, dark sea. Ms. Grant cleared her throat, the sound like a gavel striking in the silence. She slid a thick, black-bound folder across the polished surface. "The situation is quite simple," she began, her voice a cool, rhythmic hum of authority. "The property in Greenwich is currently in technical default. The $600,000 balance required for final funding has been withheld by my client, Mrs. Linda Miller. Furthermore, as the primary title holder and the sole source of the down payment, Mrs. Miller has the legal right to dissolve the current ownership structure if the conditions of her investment are not met." Erica's head snapped up. "Investment? You called it a gift. You sat in this very room and called it an investment in our marriage." "An investment," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel, "requires a return. I didn't ask for interest in currency, Erica. I asked for interest in the form of respect. I asked for a seat at the table I provided. I asked to be a mother to the son I raised. You decided those terms were too expensive." I leaned forward, the leather of my chair creaking, a sound that felt like the house itself sighing. "Here are my terms," I said, laying them out with a slow, surgical precision. "They are non-negotiable. If you wish to remain in that house, if you wish to avoid the public humiliation of a foreclosure notice on a white colonial in Greenwich, you will sign this agreement." I watched as Jared finally lifted his head. His eyes were glassy, reflecting the green pool of light from the desk lamp. "First," I began, "the Wilsons will vacate the guest room. Tonight. They may be your family, but they are guests in a home they did not build. No live-in visitors will be permitted for more than 48 hours without my written consent. Mr. Wilson made a sound, a choked, huffing noise of outrage, but a single look from Ms. Grant silenced him. Second, I continued, my voice hardening, my role in this home will be acknowledged. Publicly. To your neighbors, to your friends, and to the people you so proudly toasted your independence to. You will admit that this house stands because of my husband's legacy and my own hand. Gratitude is no longer optional. It is a contractual requirement. Erica let out a jagged, bitter laugh. You want us to beg? You want to parade us around like children? I want the truth, I replied. Third, and most importantly, I will remain a co-owner of the property for the next 5 years. I will have a key. I will have access. Consider it insurance against your forgetfulness. If at any point the boundaries you so cherish become a wall to shut me out again, I will pull the funding and the house will be sold. The room went cold. Erica shot to her feet, her palms slamming against the mahogany table with a violent thwack. This is manipulation, Susan, she screamed, her voice breaking into a shrill, ugly screech. Pure, unadulterated manipulation. You're using your money to hold us hostage. You're turning our marriage into a cage. You're a monster holding a noose over our heads. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I simply looked at the woman who had tried to erase me from the very marrow of my son's life. I gave you the rope to build a swing, Erica, I said softly. You're the one who turned it into a noose. Jared. Erica turned to him, her voice desperate, her hands reaching for his shoulders. Say something. Tell her she can't do this. Tell her we won't be controlled like this. We'll find the money elsewhere. We don't need her. Jared stood up slowly. He moved with the weight of a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back for months. He looked at Erica, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw the spell break. He looked at the woman who had encouraged him to silence his mother, who had treated his father's hard work as a dated inconvenience, and who had turned his home into a sterile beige museum of her own ego. He gently pulled her hands off his shoulders. We can't find the money elsewhere, Erica, he said, his voice raw, cracking, but filled with a sudden, devastating honesty. We don't have $600,000. We don't even have 60. We've been living in a dream that we didn't earn. Jared, don't you dare. It's called respect, Erica. Jared roared, the sound echoing off the oak-paneled walls, vibrating through the floorboards. And we haven't given her any. Not an ounce. She gave us everything, the roof, the floor, the very air we're breathing in that house, and we treated her like she was a trespasser. We let your parents take over the room she should have been welcomed in. We changed the furniture she bought with love because it was too heavy for your aesthetic. He turned to me, his eyes brimming with a tidal wave of grief and recognition. Mom, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I fell asleep. I let myself believe that being a man meant cutting you out. I was wrong. I was a coward. For a moment the room vanished. The lawyer, the Wilsons, the cold legal documents, they all faded into the background. In that heartbeat I saw my son again. I saw the boy who used to bring me dandelions with the same look of earnest, broken hope. I saw the man David would have wanted him to be. The long dark dream was over. The waking up had begun. Erica sagged back into her chair, her fire extinguished by the cold, hard weight of Jared's betrayal. She looked at the papers on the table, then at her parents, then back at the son who was no longer her consort, but a man finding his soul. Sign the papers, Erica, Jared said, his voice low and steady. Or we pack our bags tonight. I'm not losing my mother for a house in Greenwich. With a hand that shook so violently the pen clattered against the wood, Erica signed. The sound of the ink scratching against the paper was the final note of the requiem. One by one we signed. Ms. Grant notarized each page with a sharp mechanical thud. The sound of a door being locked or perhaps for the first time truly being opened. I gathered the documents, sliding them into my folder. The reckoning was over. The power had shifted not back to me but into its rightful place, where love is anchored by honor, and where the foundation is respected. I stood up, looking at the Wilsons, who were already scurrying toward the exit like rats fleeing a ship that had refused to sink. I looked at Erica, who sat in a silence that was finally, blessedly quiet. And then I looked at Jared. I'll see you at the house tomorrow, son, I said. We're going to move the sideboard back into the dining room. Jared nodded, a single tear falling onto the mahogany table. I walked out of the room, my heels clicking on the tile with a steady rhythmic dignity. I was no longer a ghost. I was no longer an ATM. I was Linda Miller. And the deed to my soul was finally back in my own hands. The morning sun over Greenwich was no longer a clinical glare. It was a soft amber benediction that seemed to wash the white siding of the colonial house clean. I stood on the porch, my hands tucked into the pockets of a cardigan that had once belonged to David, watching a scene that felt like the final, hushed movement of a long and discordant symphony. The Wilsons were leaving. The same SUV that had carried them into my son's life with such proprietary arrogance was now being loaded with a frantic, silent urgency. There were no polite goodbyes. No strained mentions of getting together for the holidays. The social veneers had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, jagged edges of pride and the cold reality of a lost gamble. Mr. Wilson, who had once sat on my furniture like a king on a throne, now struggled with a designer leather suitcase, his face a mask of purple-hued indignation. Mrs. Wilson didn't look at me at all. She kept her eyes fixed on the driveway, her movements stiff and robotic, as if acknowledging my presence would force her to acknowledge her own irrelevance. I watched them from the elevation of the porch I had paid for. I felt no surge of petty triumph. There was no joy in watching another family dismantle their presence. Instead, I felt a profound sense of relief, a physical lifting of a weight I hadn't realized was crushing the breath out of me. As the SUV door slammed and the engine roared to life, the atmosphere of entitlement, an air so thick it had felt like breathing through wool, finally began to evaporate. As the car pulled away, the silence that settled over the lawn was different. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or the silence of boundaries. It was the silence of a house that was finally, after months of haunting, being allowed to breathe. I turned to see Jared standing in the doorway. He looked different. The slumped, defeated posture that had made him look like a ghost of his former self was gone. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted, and for the first time in years, the light in his eyes didn't flicker with the frantic need to please a woman who viewed him as an accessory. "They're gone, Mom," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "I know, Jared," I replied. He stepped out onto the porch and stood beside me. We watched the dust settle on the gravel driveway in silence. Then without a word he reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, warm, the grip of a man who had finally found his footing on solid ground. "Let's go inside," he whispered. "We have work to do." Walking through the halls of the house now was a revelation. Without the Wilsons' presence, without the constant, buzzing frequency of Erica's disapproval, the rooms felt larger, brighter. The sterile beige and cream decor, which had once felt like a hospital wing, now just looked like a blank canvas waiting for a soul. We walked into the garage first. There it was in the shadows, still covered by the dusty tarp, the walnut sideboard. Jared didn't wait for me to ask. He grabbed one end of the heavy, hand-carved piece, and I watched as he strained against the weight of it. "I've got it, Mom," he said, his face flushed with the effort. "I've got you." Together, mostly him though I guided the corners, we moved it back. We carried the legacy of David's hard work through the kitchen, past the marble island that no longer felt like a battlefield, and into the dining room. When we set it down against the far wall, the thud it made was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was an anchor dropped into the heart of the home. Jared stood back, wiping sweat from his brow, looking at the sideboard as if seeing it for the first time. He reached out and touched the intricate carvings of the roses. "I remember this," he said softly. "I remember Dad polishing this in the old house. I remember the way it smelled like lemon oil in Sunday afternoons." He turned to me then, and the air between us suddenly grew heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. He didn't look away this time. He didn't stare at the floor. He walked over to me and took my hands in his, and I saw the deep, resonant regret of a man who had stared into the abyss of his own betrayal and finally recoiled at the sight. "Mom," he began, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that tore at my heart. "I almost traded you. I almost traded 30 years of your love, Dad's memory, and my own soul for a facade, for a cleaner look. For the approval of people who didn't even care about the man I was, only the house I could provide. Jared, you don't have to. I do, he interrupted, his voice gaining strength. This isn't the apology of a child who got caught, Mom. This is the apology of a man who realized he almost let the most important person in his life become a ghost in her own story. I stood by and watched her erase you. I stayed silent when I should have roared. I let them treat your generosity like a weakness because I was too weak to stand up and say that you were the foundation of everything I am. He pulled me into a hug, not the hurried, distracted squeeze of the housewarming party, but a deep anchors-away embrace. I buried my face in his chest, and for a moment, I was no longer the stakeholder or the title holder. I was just a mother whose son had come home from a very long, very dark war. I'm so sorry, he whispered into my hair. I'm so incredibly sorry. I let myself weep then. I wept for the months of invisibility, for the dinner of dust, for the coldness of the boundaries. But mostly I wept because the bridge I had built, the one I thought had been burned to the ground, was still standing. It had been scorched, yes, but the stone was still there. After a long time we pulled apart. Jared wiped his eyes and gave me a small bittersweet smile. The Wilsons left some things in the guest room, he said, looking toward the stairs. Erica is upstairs packing their leftovers. She's quiet, Mom. I think she finally understands that she's living in a house with walls, not a kingdom where she's the only one who matters. And you, Jared? I asked. Are you going to be okay? I'm going to be better, he said firmly. I'm going to be the man Dad expected me to be. A man who protects the people who built him. We spent the rest of the afternoon purging the house of its sterile coldness. We moved the fussy little chair back from the garage and placed it in the sunny corner of the living room. We pulled the indigo rug out from its storage and rolled it over the beige carpet, the deep blues and rich reds breathing life back into the space. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, I sat in my chair, the one I used to read to him in. The house felt warm, felt heavy with history, felt real. Erica came down the stairs then, carrying a box of her parents' belongings. She stopped when she saw me sitting there, the walnut sideboard gleaming behind me, the indigo rug beneath my feet. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes wasn't love. Not yet, and perhaps not ever, but it was respect. It was the look of someone who had realized that the gardener she tried to evict was the only reason the garden still existed. She walked past me and out the front door, her heels clicking on the floorboards with a measured, humbled pace. Jared came into the room with 2 mugs of tea. He didn't use the designer coasters. He just sat on the ottoman at my feet the way he used to when he was 10 years old. The deed still bears your name, Mom, he said, looking up at me. It does, I said, taking a sip of the warm amber tea. But the house finally feels like it belongs to all of us. The exodus of the entitled was over. The atmosphere of greed had evaporated, leaving behind something far more valuable. A family that was no longer perfect, but was finally blessedly honest. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the sideboard. The roses in the wood seemed to glow in the twilight. We had reclaimed the keys, we had reclaimed the furniture, and we had reclaimed my son. As the stars began to poke through the Greenwich sky, I realized that sometimes you have to lock the doors to show people how much it hurts to be on the outside. And sometimes you have to break a house to find the home hidden inside. The evening air in Greenwich was no longer sharp with the frost of exclusion. It was a soft velvet embrace, perfumed by the late-blooming gardenias and the scent of damp earth after a gentle afternoon rain. I stood on the patio, a glass of amber-colored iced tea in my hand, watching the world I had fought to reclaim. Strings of warm amber bulbs swayed gently between the ancient maples, casting a honeyed glow over the lawn, the same lawn where, weeks ago, I had stood as a ghost on the curb. This was not a housewarming. We had already done that, and the fire had nearly consumed us all. This was something quieter, something more profound. It was an acknowledgement. A dozen people were scattered across the garden, a few neighbors who had witnessed the exodus of the entitled, a couple of David's old colleagues, and close friends who had known me when I was a young mother in a drafty apartment. The laughter was low, the music was a soft, acoustic hum, and for the first time since the closing of the deed, the conversation felt honest. There were no porcelain smiles here. No clinical displays of unearned status. The air was thick with something rare in this neighborhood. The weight of truth. I watched Jared move among the guests. He wasn't the frantic, hollow-eyed man I had seen in the attorney's office. He walked with a grounded, quiet confidence, his eyes clear and attentive. Every few minutes, he would catch my gaze across the garden and offer a small private nod. A son's wordless, "I see you." At one point he stepped toward the center of the patio, raising his glass. The guests quieted, the hum of the crickets rising to fill the gap. "I'd like to say a few words," Jared began, his voice steady, though I could hear the faint, emotional rasp at the edges. He looked at the house, the white colonial that glowed like a pearl in the twilight, and then he looked directly at me. "Most of you know that we've had some growing pains settling into this home. But I want to be very clear about why we are standing here tonight. We are here because of a legacy of hard work, a lifetime of sacrifice, and the unwavering strength of my mother." He paused and I felt a lump form in my throat, a warm aching pressure. "For a long time," he continued, "I let myself believe that independence meant forgetting where I came from. I allowed myself to treat the foundation of my life like it was a burden. But I've learned that a house is just a pile of bricks and wood until it's anchored by respect. This world, our world, was made possible by Linda Miller. Not just by her signature but by her heart. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure she is never a guest in a home she built." The applause was soft, but it felt like a roar in my soul. There was no mention of cleaner looks or modern boundaries. There was only the simple, devastatingly beautiful truth. Jared hadn't just given me an apology. He had given me my place back. I looked over at Erica. She was standing by the rose bushes, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wasn't the general on a battlefield anymore. The brittle, triumphant energy that had once radiated from her had been replaced by a quiet, measured humility. She had signed the legal agreement, the insurance policy against her own forgetfulness, and the reality of that contract had grounded her. She caught my eye and walked over. She didn't hug me, we weren't there yet and perhaps we never would be, but she reached out and touched my arm. "The garden looks beautiful, Linda," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you for staying." "I didn't stay for the house, Erica," I replied, my voice firm but kind. "I stayed for what the house was supposed to represent." She nodded, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes. "I know. Jared told me about the sideboard, about what David said. I'm learning." I watched her walk back toward the house. She was a woman who had tried to build a life out of glass and mirrors, only to realize that the first stone of truth would shatter it all. She was no longer my enemy. She was a student of the boundaries she had once tried to weaponize against me. As the night deepened and the guests began to depart, their good nights trailing like smoke into the cool air, I found myself alone on the porch. I sat in my fussy little chair, the one with the high back and the floral upholstery that Erica had once banished to the garage. It was back in its place, tucked into the corner of the porch where the light from the foyer spilled over the floorboards. I looked at the house, the white colonial I had bought, the pillars, the granite, the walnut sideboard now gleaming in the dining room, the indigo rug anchoring the living room floor. It was no longer a mirage. It was no longer a trophy for an ungrateful daughter-in-law or a fortress for a cowardly son. It was finally a home. I realized then that my journey over the last few months hadn't been about a $200,000 down payment or a $600,000 mortgage. It hadn't even been about the keys or the locks. It had been about the architecture of the soul. I had learned the most difficult lesson a mother can ever face. That love without boundaries is not love at all. It is a slow-motion surrender. By allowing Jared to treat me as an intruder, I had been complicit in his loss of honor. By letting Erica erase my history, I had been helping her build a future without a foundation. Generosity is a beautiful thing, but it must walk hand in hand with dignity. To give is an act of grace. To be used is an act of self-destruction. I had been forced to break the world I had created to save the people I loved from their own arrogance. I had been the storm that cleared the air. I felt a presence beside me. Jared sat down on the steps, leaning his back against the railing. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. "I'm more than okay, Jared," I said, reaching out to ruffle his hair, a gesture I hadn't dared to do in months. I'm home. Yeah, he breathed, looking out at the dark garden. We are. I leaned back and closed my eyes, the rhythm of my heart finally matching the steady, peaceful pulse of the house. I had spent 40 years being a wife and a mother, roles I cherished with every fiber of my being. But tonight I was something more. I am Linda Miller. My name is on the deed, etched in the black ink of a legal contract that ensures my security. But more importantly, my name is back on the list of people who will never be looked down upon again. I have reclaimed the keys to my house, but I have also reclaimed the keys to my own worth. I looked at the master key glinting on the table beside me. It was cold, silver, and heavy. It was a tool of entry, a symbol of power, and a reminder of the price of respect. Love is the foundation, but respect is the roof that keeps the rain out. And in this white colonial in Greenwich, the roof was finally, blessedly secure. As the last light in the hallway clicked off and the house settled into the quiet of the night, I realized that the greatest investment I ever made wasn't the money I slid across a mahogany table. It was the moment I stood up for myself and whispered into the silence. I am here. And I am not going anywhere. The legacy of David Miller was safe. My son was awake. And the deed to my dignity was finally permanently mine. I am truly humbled that you chose to spend your time witnessing this story of boundaries and betrayal. It takes courage to stand up when the world expects you to stay silent. Have you ever had to draw a line to protect your soul? Let's spark a conversation in the comments and support one another in our journeys toward respect. If you believe that love should never mean surrender, please subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Your support ensures that these stories of strength continue to be told.